So I think now there'd be a consensus of opinion that a sense of pan-Bougainvillean identity provided the background for the conflict, but that the socio-economic impacts of the mine triggered localized acts of sabotage against the mine, and that the heavy-handed response of PNG security forces, first the police, then the defence force, really escalated the conflict, and it became this island-wide struggle. So the island became the scale of struggle, but a very fragile scale because, again, Bougainville is internally heterogeneous in an ethno-linguistic sense. There are also important differences amongst Bougainvilleans themselves, socio-economic differences largely to do with the ecological geography of the island and the introduction of cocoa as a cash crop from the 1960s. And Bougainville, as is the case with many large islands in Melanesia, is also crisscrossed by all sorts of social and political movements that have all sorts of different agendas, including in relation to large-scale mining. I think other important factors in the origins of the Bougainville conflict include the fact that there are large numbers of young men in the population who had been over several decades marginalized from multiple orders, from the market order, from social orders, and so on and so forth. And these men were mobilized into the conflict. And there are also these spatial patterns of inequality, which I just alluded to, a very strong north-south kind of pattern of inequality, again, to do with the ecological geography of the island, and the advent of the mine really intensified and exacerbated these pre-existing patterns and processes of socio-economic inequality. Okay, so moving now to the conflict in Solomon Islands. Again, we don't have time here to go into a great deal of detail about it, but I will note in looking at this map that I'm going to be talking about, particularly about the island of Guadalcanal, right in the middle there, which hosts the capital Honiara. And I'll also draw your attention to the neighboring island of Malaita, which in terms of population is easily the most populous island in the country, accounting for around 1/3 of the total population of Solomon Islands. And again, I'll note how these kind of island-wide identities, so during the conflict, the so-called ethnic tension, a Guadalcanal-wide and a Malaita-wide identity were really mobilized. And again, in this sense, islands became the critical scale of struggle, but again, a very fragile scale. As was the case in Bougainville, these island-wide identities have really been produced by the introduction of capitalist social relations under colonialism. So you may have heard of the so-called blackbirding period from around 1860 to 1910, where literally tens of thousands of Melanesians from the region of Island Melanesia in particular were taken to work as indentured labourers on the sugarcane plantations of Queensland and elsewhere. And in the case of Solomon Islands, the vast bulk of those labourers were Malaitans, and it was really through that process that a Malaitan identity was formed. And indeed, following the Second World War, the capital was established at Honiara to take advantage of the infrastructure that the American forces had left there, but also in order to take advantage of the area to the east of Honiara, known as the plains of Guadalcanal, the Guadalcanal Plains. Now, this region is easily the largest area of kind of arable, fertile land in the whole country, and the idea, one of the ideas but behind establishing Honiara, was that the colonial administration was going to develop large-scale agricultural enterprises and projects on the Guadalcanal Plains. And sorry, I just had another random interruption by the IT people who sent me a share screen request or something. Anyway, So yes, so what happened after the war was that Malaitans started to move over in increasing numbers, and they settled on the plains, and they moved into Honiara, and over time, their numbers increased, and a number of social tensions began to emerge between Malaitan settlers and Gwale, meaning indigenous people of Guadalcanal, Gwale landowners on North Guadalcanal, and these are really struggles over access to land and livelihoods. And during the so-called ethnic tension, Gwale militants evicted, I think it was around 30,000 Malaitans from their homes on North Guadalcanal. And I'll also note the Gold Ridge mine in the centre of the island there. And whilst Gold Ridge played a much lesser role in the origins of this conflict, and this is because the Gold Ridge mine, as well as these agricultural enterprises on the north coast of the island, in particular a large oil palm operation, have featured centrally in this long-standing grievance on Guadalcanal, which I characterize as development equity, a long-standing grievance about the fact that Guadalcanal province provides significant revenue to the national government from resource developments on the island, but receives proportionally much less in terms of grants and government services. And I have here a quote from an ex-militant whom I interviewed many years ago now, back in 2006, who said, if the government addresses this issue, state government, meaning devolution of power to Guadalcanal province, which would become a state, everyone will go back to their places and Guadalcanal will become one of the richest islands. We have all the resources. So again, you see the invocation, if you like, of the island in this grievance of kind of development equity. Very much a benefit sharing grievance between the scale of the island province and the national scale, the national government. So this sort of grievance really drives islandist political agendas for autonomy, or in the case of Bougainville, as we've seen. Now, importantly, this grievance is expressed particularly strongly by people from the southern side of Guadalcanal, so-called Weather Coast, which, as is the case on Bougainville, is ecologically constrained and where people express a strong sense of relative deprivation, and for very good reason, because of its ecological characteristics and its geography. The Weather Coast has been historically underdeveloped, remote, isolated, and so on. And people on the Weather Coast say things like, we oppose development in terms of ripping it out and building up different people, different nations, different places. All the resources which they harvest from Guadalcanal, they use for different people from other provinces. So this sense of other people are benefiting from the resources on their island whilst they are kind of languishing. And I've just got a few slides here of the Weather Coast to give you a sense of its ecological geography, right? So you've got these massive mountains that come right down to the sea. It's called the Weather Coast because for 6 months of the year it's pounded by the southwest east trade winds, and small boat travel is actually impossible because of the enormously rough seas. People have to walk across the island if they want to go to Honiara to access basic health services and so on. It rains a lot. People really struggle with their subsistence agriculture. They plant food gardens on steep slopes. It rains, they wash away. There are periodic food shortages, and so on and so forth. Now, as I mentioned in the case of Bougainville, Guadalcanal too also hosts a socio-political movement called the Moro movement, which espouses a kind of conservationist ethos, if you like, in relation to large-scale developments such as Gold Ridge Mine. So here again, I have a quote from a follower of the movement who says, development such as Gold Ridge is not development in terms of our definition. It's a disaster. In terms of Gold Ridge, that's one of our aims. We want to stop that. So the Moro movement really espouses an ideology of preserving and protecting the land, people, and resources of Bougainville. of Guadalcanal. And this Moro movement is very much centered on the weather coast, and its ideology was very influential with all of the militant leaders, all of the Guali militant leaders, all of whom hail from the weather coast region. As I mentioned before, strong resonances with Bougainville, with what's known on Bougainville as the Mekamui movement, which again espouses a similar kind of epistemology, if you like, of development, a similar vision for development, one which is based on kind of small holder agricultural development, small scale artisanal mining, and so on, and which is directly opposed to large scale mining. So just briefly to summarize, I've suggested today that extractive industries interact with pre-existing landscapes of social and political forces to produce contentious politics, and that these politics are fundamentally spatialized. They play out within and between different scales, and I've spoken about the scale of customary land ownership, the scale of islandism, and the scale of the nation. Okay, so there are strong tensions in the encounter with extractive industries within and between these scales. In the case of Bougainville and Guadalcanal being islands, I think islandness really matters. The fact that you have this co-production, if you like, on these large Melanesian islands of scale and territory, they become very powerful containers for kind of identity politics. They become a scale of struggle in these kind of benefit sharing tensions, particularly with the scale above them, which is the scale of the nation, the national government. But they're also very fragile scales for struggle. They can also become powerful arenas for internal contestation, and also powerful arenas for a very strong sense of relative deprivation amongst people who live in areas such as the weather coast. So recognizing and managing these scalar tensions is critical for the regulation of resource conflict in Melanesia generally, but in particular, I would suggest in island Melanesia, and that might be something that we can develop a little bit more in class. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you all at the lecture. Thank you.